Good. Okay, well, welcome everyone to this this OGA webinar on conversion to organic horticulture. My name is Phil Sumption from the OGA, and I'm really pleased to welcome Roger Hitchings and Tim Deane to this call. Most of you, if you've been involved with the OGA over the years, will know them very well. Very experienced growers, and I'm very sort of proud and privileged to have called them friends and colleagues over the years. And we've all got a lot of experience in organic growing and in organic horticulture and in conversion advice. So we're here for you to pick our brains once we get going. So thank you all, and I'm going to start off myself with a short presentation, and I'll share my screen, and hopefully I don't know whether, let me know if you can see it. Does it come through or not yet? Yep. Okay. Great. I realize my screen is over here, so I'm going to look in a different direction. But anyway, I'm just going to talk. Oh, it hasn't started this actual slideshow, has it? Yeah, there we go. Yeah. Okay. So my experience is I've had I started as an organic grower back in the late 80s, and I've worked as a grower in Somerset for a number of years, and then in 1999, after a spell overseas, I went I started working at Garden Organic. It was HDRA at the time, on a really big government-funded project on conversion to organic field vegetable production. So it's a bit historical. It's quite a long time ago now. It ran from 1996 through to 2004, and but I think, looking back on it, I am, as I have been over the last couple of days in preparation for this, I think there's a few interesting things to still that are pertinent and relevant that I will mention. So this picture here is of one of our farms that we were studying. It's in Bedfordshire, and we have Martha and Mark on the left, who recently, I think this week, celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. They were students, interns at Garden Organic, and they're still together, which is brilliant. So just to briefly go through some of the results of that. It was there were HRI Wellesbourne Horticultural Research International, as well as now at University of Warwick, had quite a large area of horticultural trials, and they set aside a field there for conversion to organic field vegetable production, and we monitored that and studied that over a number of years, really looking at different aspects of fertility building strategies, and whether you could go for a shorter period of clover or a longer, or the more traditional sort of year and a half of grass clover before you went into vegetables. And also we had a number of commercial farms which we monitored also through conversion, and that was just monitoring what was happening on the ground and what was happening economically with those farms. And we also involved advisors. So Roger was one of our advisors that helped us or helped visit the farms and guide them through conversion, and we were monitoring all of that process as it happened. And these farms were from Cornwall through to Lancashire. And some of the things that I just tease out is obviously a lot of findings and a lot of stuff that over that period of research and to talk about. But the farms were mostly very commercially driven at that time in the late 90s, when they were converting, and a lot of them were had phased conversions. over a number of years, particularly the bigger farms. And one of the biggest challenges for those farms, and it will be for anyone, is the conversion period during fertility building and the loss of income during that time. One of the things I found very interesting, really looking at some of the results yesterday, was that we found that the farms on averaged over 3 years between 400 and 500 hours spent on knowledge gathering. That's going to farm walks, going to finding out, learning information about organic growing and the organic market, and really researching what they needed to do. So I think, you know, that is something that you have to bear in mind if you're converting, that you kind of there is a lot to think about. And the other thing, which we'll talk a little bit about, what some of the payments and grants and things, I mean, very, very briefly, because mostly we're going to focus on the more practical aspects of conversion. But what was found that during on the farms that we studied, that the payments were useful, but they were only contributing something like 3 to 5% of net farm income. So it's not something that you should totally rely on. You should get your business model working without the grants, and they're great if you can get them. In terms of agronomic factors, then as people converted, a lot of them were already vegetable growing, or they were arable growers that wanted to grow a bit of veg, or they were mixed farms. But whichever background they came on, when they became organic, they had a much more diverse cropping rotation and system, and that meant there was a lot to learn about in terms of growing those crops. And where there were problems, then that was where they had less experience, either less experience of growing or less experience because they were crops they weren't familiar with. And one of the biggest challenges, what we found, was soil compaction and soil structure. And I think that the farms seem to find that, you know, they kind of once they converted, there's no hiding place if you're organic. If there's soil structure damage, then the rooting and the crop development and soil biology just doesn't work properly, and you can't hide it. So that was very evident. What most people expected to be the biggest challenge when they were converting, and they were all really worried about, was weeds. But it turned out for most of them, the weeds were managed pretty effectively. They had systems in place to do that, and they got better at doing it. So that was much less of a problem than they expected. Although over the latter years there were some issues with a few more perennials creeping in that led to some concerns. Same with pests and diseases. There weren't really any severe losses to pests and diseases, and the farms generally had kind of either they were coming from conventional and had quite interventionist approaches, or they were more laissez-faire in their approaches, and people's attitudes towards pests and diseases changed as the project went on. And it's one thing we talk about as, you know, big conversion that goes on. The biggest thing, space to convert, is that between the years. And I think the farms that were succeeded and are now still organic are ones that kind of really took on that approach and managed things in the right way, rather than kind of still having that conventional approach to input substitution as to what they can use, what product can you use instead of this that I can't use anymore. Another interesting sort of finding really was that in terms of the importance of the fertility building crops, and particularly that period in the spring, so making sure that you leave them leaves them a reasonable length of time in the spring when the clovers and things are doing their most work and when the most material is being built up can be incorporated. And though that really had benefits for, as opposed to early incorporation. In economic terms, I mean, it's a long time ago, and there were different times and different farms that were converting, but as their experiences increased, then the gross margins increased and costs reduced. There were lots of issues with the market at the time, and most of the growers were supplying supermarkets, and the supermarkets were oversupplied with growers, and the specifications increased and meant that kind of a lot of the there was a lot more wastage, I think, in terms of production, which that really accounted for the lower yields, and on the farms that we studied, and yields were 20% less than the Organic Farm Management Handbook sort of suggested yields, but I think now a lot of more intensive growers are finding that they can produce a lot more yields that are higher than those figures. There were also some problems of profitability where people had introduced livestock into the farming system in order to provide fertility or to graze lays, and those weren't really contributing much economically. So that's the story of the conversion project very, very quickly. Now, briefly, I'm just going to show what the current situation is in terms of the grants, and this is straight out of the forthcoming Organic Farm Management Handbook, which we are working on at the moment, so you can. I'm probably not going to go through these figures on the screen, but I'll send the presentation through, and you can look at them, and this is the English rates. So for conversion, there the rates are £471 per hectare per year. Oop, gone the wrong way. And top fruit has a much higher rate in England. In Scotland, then they don't really. The vegetables and fruit are all sort of lumped in together, and they have sort of similar payments over years 1 and 2, and then reduced over years 3 to 5. In Wales, the rates are you can see. Oh, sorry, keep going the wrong way. Yeah. So rotational land, I guess, is the one that's important there. And then there are also, if anyone's in Northern Ireland, and there are rates there which are probably very difficult to read on your screen. But that's the latest that we have in terms of what conversion payments are available. And I'm just going to end briefly my part, and I think I've got one more slide after this, but I think I'll leave that till later if we need it, which is a final checklist, and just say that the Organic Farm Management Handbook is on its way. And the other thing to mention is that that there are, through the Organic Research Centre, we do provide, because that's another of my hats is working for the Organic Research Centre. There are interest-free loans available through the Deane Organic Fund, so that's well worth investigating. And there's information in the latest Organic Grower, and I can also send it to a link to the Deane Organic Fund in the chat once we're done, if anyone's interested. So I'm going to end my slideshow now, unless, and I can't see any if there are any sort of immediate questions, but if not, then I will go through to get Roger to prepare his slides. You're muted, Roger. But
okay, yeah, you're going to unshare, Phil.
oh, I thought I had. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. And right. Okay. Good evening, everybody. This is a very new thing for me. I'm very used to doing Zoom music sessions, but that means I'm normally sitting here with a guitar and singing. Anyway, this is the webinar, and I will work through a few slides now. These slides are going to be a bit wordy. I'm leaving it to Tim to show you pictures, and you've seen some pictures with Phil. I had a look at my photographs taken at the time of when I was organic growing for the local college, and although there's some rather fine photographs of crops, but there's nothing really that informs the process of conversion. I think we were a bit too busy with that. Anyway, cracking on, this is just very briefly about me. My background educationally is soil science, and that's the thing that kind of informed my enthusiasm and so on over the years. I was a smallholder in the 1970s, attempted self-sufficiency, but not necessarily very well. Became an organic grower, amongst other things, with the local college in the 80s, and then became a lecturer in the same college, and then was, well, I suppose, headhunted off to the Organic Advisory Service at what was then Elm Farm Research Centre, and became very involved in the OCIS scheme, which Phil has touched on. Retired in 2013, but still do occasional things. Okay, well, the OCIS scheme, which is referred to, was, I should say, it was a series of government-funded programs that informed and advised producers about organic conversion, and this was a free service to producers. And I think there's probably a number of producers kind of almost grabbed the opportunity to have somebody visit their farm or their holding just because it was free. But the Elm Farm and its Organic Research Centre and Organic Centre Wales, I think, collectively delivered something approaching 10,000 visits over the period of probably about 14 or 15 years. Visits on farm, walk the farm, talk to the farmer, talk to the grower, to look at the potential for conversion and to identify any problems, of which sometimes there were some very significant problems, and also to point people in the right direction in terms of getting information. And they also got detailed reports that I think, generally speaking, from the feedback that we received at the time, were seen as very useful in the main. There's different provision in Scotland. There was information provided by the Scottish Agricultural College at the time, I believe. It didn't necessarily involve farm visits, but there was this great emphasis from governments to encourage conversion to organic production. Because I think there was, at the time, or the thing that stimulated it was a difference between demand and production. Anyway, moving on to conversion, and this is a very dry slide, but the point, and I'll come on to it in the next slide anyway, is that if you're going to do organic conversion in the fullest sense of the word, you will have to register with an organic certification body, and therefore you are restricted in what you can do and what you can use in terms of your production system, and you need to convert the holding all in one go or progressively, according to a conversion plan agreed with your certification body. And again, it's an interesting point about this: separate and identifiable units of land large enough to permit organic production to be developed and sustained. And I know one OCIS visit I did to somebody in Somerset, it was effectively a back garden that included a small stable and a septic tank. And it was clearly, just an absolute non-starter, but that was the exception rather than the rule. And the enterprise, if it is being developed as part of a larger enterprise, must have its own accounts and record keeping system and be financially separate. And of course, the deal is with registration is that you have to agree to be inspected and monitored by your certifying body. And that, I think we can probably all vouch for, can be quite a demanding process. Anyway, scenarios. A lot of the scenarios I remember dealing with as part of OCIS was people who bought a plot of land somewhere and were, had it in their minds to produce organic food for generally local production, but not exclusively. So it was, a piece of land that was new to them, as well as being new to the visiting advisor. That's one approach, and often involved a steep learning curve if the people concerned had not had very much or any indeed relevant experience. And sometimes the visits involved not only assessing the land and advising on what could be done with it, but also making sure that the interested people got the necessary information and experience to make a go of it. Whereas a conversion of an existing holding or enterprise, and these are the kind of holdings that Phil was describing in his presentation as part of the conversion to field-scale vegetables product. I think exclusively they were all existing holdings, and they at least had a going concern, or reasonable going concern. Now, of course, it is possible to convert without registration, but it is not strictly conversion, because you cannot, at the end of whatever process is adopted, describe produce and the food produced as organic. There are legal restrictions on the use of that term, which require you to go through the process of registration with one of the several certification bodies that you could choose. And the process, well, gathering information is vitally important. And interestingly, Phil described the number of hours that the holdings in the project put into gathering information in as many different ways as they possibly could. And these are some of the sources of information, but there's by no means exclusive. The OGA, of course, has got a huge, if you're a member of the OGA, you've got access to a huge amount of information through past copies of the Organic Grower. And of course, the webinars such as this and the many others that are being put on at the moment are great. Certification bodies, generally speaking, you can inquire of them and get information from them. And if you sign up with one or other of them, then you will get quite a lot of information coming from that direction. Lots of publications out there. Phil mentioned the Organic Farm Management Handbook and the almost imminent publication of the Organic Vegetable Growers. What's the precise title? I can't remember, Phil. But anyway, farm walks and a whole range of other publications are out there. And it is true to say that there's much more information around nowadays than back in the days of the 70s and 80s when the original OGA was first established, and people were essentially learning by experience, and then at a later date then putting that into books and talks and so on, where the information could be disseminated. Conferences, of course, another source of information. Choose the certification body, and that is very much something for the individual to choose. No doubt people would advise as to which way to go, but it really has to be the grower or the farmer's choice. Get a copy of their standards and read them and get a feel for what is actually required before you start the process of doing it, because there's nothing worse than getting a conversion process going and then without fully understanding what is required and what it involves. Talking to other growers, of course, is great, and there's the forum on the OGA website, and if you are able to physically meet with other growers, and very often there are local groups, local meetings and so on, then do that and pick as many brains as you can find, and etc. Do everything possible to get as much information as you need. Now, the enterprise, we're assuming horticulture because this is the OGA and it's converting land to organic horticulture. But of course, that includes a number of different aspects. We've already seen through the payment options. The top fruit perennial cropping is a significantly different process than annual cropping, field production, and protected cropping, of course, in tunnels, greenhouses. And all of these will need their own almost process of conversion if they exist to start with. But of course, livestock may be a factor. Very often on small-scale holdings, there'll be some poultry and even possibly some arable cropping as well. But they all have to be taken into account when planning conversion. It's very difficult to convert things in isolation unless you can physically define an area. Put a physical line across the holding that distinguishes, and then you run into all sorts of issues about avoiding crossover. Anyway, the conversion plan is pretty much a requirement with every certifying body, but it isn't intended to be a chore just to keep your certifier happy. It's far more important in that it is a roadmap to guide you through the whole process. And ideally should cover at least one complete rotation. Much will depend on what you're planning to grow and how what you actually come up with in terms of a designed rotation. I know when we started out at the college, I had in mind a very simple rotation based on feedback from local wholesalers, and it essentially was brassicas, salads, roots, fertility building, 4 years, dead simple. However, we were able to bring in some advice from the Organic Advisory Service, ironically, and the advisor said, "You're a college, you've got to demonstrate everything," and came up with 2 8-year rotations. And we compromised on a 12-year rotation in the end, with 3 years fertility building involving Lucerne, and that was in West Wales. As it happened, we made it work, but it shouldn't have done. You've got to get background of the land that you're planning to convert. If you've been there, if it's your holding and you've been there a while, then of course you will have the history. If you've just bought a field, 2 fields, a small holding, even a small farm, you're going to need to find out what the history is. And if these are just isolated plots of land, it may not be straightforward. But very often you've got people, the previous owners, and people in the area can provide information. This can be important in terms of the kind of inputs that might have been applied to that land in the past. You need to produce a description of the overall system planned, and a timetable of dates, fields, enter and complete conversion. And the components, you need to be setting out your intentions, in a sense. How are you going to maintain fertility? And this, as I put here, linked with soil analysis. Now, personally, I don't regard soil analysis as essential, but it can be particularly useful where you're taking on a new site. I think getting a baseline assessment of fertility is really potentially very useful. You may never need to do a subsequent analysis, but at least you've got that one to kick off with. Crop rotation or rotations, you'll have a very different rotation in your polytonals compared to your open plots. If you're doing field scale, that'll be a different rotation to an intensive salad stroke herb kind of rotation. So it isn't a case of one size fits all, and also there isn't really the right rotation. I mean, it could be the right rotation for the holding, for the soil type and so on, but they vary according to what you hope to sell or what your market is asking of you, and again the soil type and so on. Weed, pest and disease control, as we heard from Phil, there were not too many problems with the holdings that were part of the project, but nonetheless you need to be setting out your approaches to these things as you should for soil management, cultivations, and conservation practice and policies. So conservation is a key part of today's organic standards, and you cannot ignore it. And of course, if there's livestock in the equation, that needs to also, and that can be even more complicated than putting a horticultural conversion plan. So if you are starting from scratch, it's probably best to get the cropping side and the land converted before you perhaps get involved in bringing in a livestock operation. Okay, so just going to run through some of those aspects to finish off with here. The rotation should be appropriate for the planned market. And of course, market research is not a part of conversion as far as the certification body is concerned, but it is a very important part of your business planning. And you need to be able to fit what you think the market wants and the crops that will supply that market into a rotation that is organically sound. And it must comply with the standards. And it should link with fertility management and include fertility building phases. So it isn't just a case of doing crop, and then start again. You've got to include at least one, if not more, fertility building phases. And how you manage your rotation carries implications for weed, pest, and disease control. So you can see this can build up to be quite a complicated affair, a conversion plan. But the rotation is not cast in stone. Just because you agree a rotation or indeed approach to some of these other elements with your certification body, there's no reason why it can't be changed if circumstances change, if your local markets, the demands of people, even fashions in certain kinds of salad crops and so on can change things. I think I went through a period of 3-4 years where I changed the rotation every year because of circumstances. But that was carried out, that was done in discussion with my inspector who came to inspect us. Soil management, soil improvement should be a primary aim because the expectation is that basically you start with the soil and it should be, when you're finished with it should be better than when you started, basically. But also know your soil types, and of course you could say, oh yes, we've got silty clay loam here, but of course it might vary from a sandy silty loam on one side to quite a heavy clay loam on the other side of the field or the holding. So it is worth getting out there with a spade, digging a number of holes and getting to know just what you've got there. That's where the analysis comes in, baseline fertility levels and the soil condition. You don't necessarily need analysis for soil condition, but you do need to get your hands in it, get the spade out, dig the hole, smell it and handle it and so on. Obviously, that would inform fertility management, and soil types can affect what can be commercially grown, and more to the point, perhaps when, because obviously sandy soils will warm up quicker, better drained and so on, whereas clay soils will tend to have higher baseline fertility. So the management is very important. Fertility building and the overall approach should be included in the conversion plan. Include the fertility building crops in the rotation, either as 1-2 year lays or judicious choices of green manures. And how do you choose? Well, it could be one or the other or both. Now, is there a need for bulky organic inputs? Now, a lot of existing holdings do use bulky organic inputs, often in not exclusively, often in the form of municipal green waste compost. You need to justify the use of any such input to your certification body. And if you've got a soil that is in good heart and has got good measurements of the primary nutrients, it may be hard to justify the need. And similarly for extra approved fertilizers, if there are identifiable problems, around trace elements and some of the minor nutrients, you again need to have a conversation with your certification body. Weed management, again, signal intended approaches in your conversion plan, because you might say, well, we anticipate problems with annual weeds, whereas, as Phil pointed out in the project report, perennial weeds often became a greater problem. The mechanical methods of control, of course, rotation design can help there. You've got weed suppressing crops versus weed susceptible crops. The use of stale or sterile seed beds, thermal and mulching methods. There's all of these things that are available. And remember that there are benefits, hard to believe, I know sometimes, but benefits of weeds, not in biodiversity, certainly as indicators. And of course, it's always the thing that if your weeds aren't growing well, then there's a good chance your crops won't grow well. Pest and disease management, similar approach, get the approaches in the plan. Be aware of any potential issues on the holding. This is where the history can be useful. Crop walk as often as possible, preferably daily, and where anything is identified, get it out if it's seen as infectious. Watering can be very useful in terms of pest and disease control, resistant tolerant varieties and so on. There are allowable inputs. Many of these are restricted, again, which means you've got to justify the use and, in fact, get permission from your certification body. Conversion in practice, well, you start with a plan, of course, but it can be overtaken by events, pests, diseases, market changes, and so on, as I've suggested. So there has to be an allowance for change. The more detailed the plan, the better, but flexibility is vital. Getting it right from the start is ideal, but don't be put off by problems. Keep going. Keep an open mind and continue to seek advice and information. And I've got a load of photographs here, but I'm not going to bore you with those. So I will.
So can everybody see this? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, because I can't see. My whole screen is full of the PowerPoint, so I can't see Phil or anybody. Yeah.
Just go for it.
So
We can see it. We can see it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fine. Sorry. Yeah. Apologies for that. It's rather typical of my last 4 days when I've been working on this PowerPoint. My relationship with Bill Gates, whoever it is, it's not very good. Anyway, Northwood Farm, spring 1984. How shall I start? I've been a farm worker down in Cornwall for 6 years on a farm. We had a tied house, 2 small children. Jan was a housewife in those blessed days when such a thing was possible. It was a conventional farm, in fact, quite a chemically orientated farm by that time. It's changed a bit over the years. And one day I got into, well, I didn't get an argument with my boss, but he accused me of various things out in the field, one of which was that I thought more of my family than I did of his farm. So we thought it was time to go, really, and it wasn't more than a year or so before I was starting to think more about my farm, or I should say our farm, than I was about my family. But anyway, that's not a lot to do with conversion, maybe. But what we were actually looking for was 2 or 3 nice fields that we could grow vegetables on. I'd been working with livestock. I was a keen gardener on the side, but I had been working with livestock, had no experience commercial organic vegetable growing. But it was something that was relatively cheap to start up and had a relatively quick return, or at least that's what we expected. So that seemed to be the thing to do. Instead of finding 2 or 3 sort of nice flattish fields on some decent ground somewhere, what we actually stumbled across was a whole farm of 24 acres, which was sort of paradise. Had been neglected, hadn't been farmed as more than a piece of offline grazing for donkey's years. And we brought it to auction just for the agricultural value of the land, because although there was a ruined house there and a bit of a shed, as you can see, the access was so difficult that nobody was looking at it as a building project. So as well as, and we bought it with the intention of growing organic vegetables, and as well as converting to organic vegetable growing, if you like, we also had to do a lot of establishment work, sort of homesteading, because the place, as I say, had been abandoned. There were no services. It was even very difficult to get into. And so instead of talking about conversion, I'm talking about pioneering, which is a rather different thing. But I'm hoping that some of what sort of comes out of this story of early years is of some interest and relevance to people thinking about conversion today. The point about paradise, of course, is that nobody actually lives there. And once you start doing things on the land, it rapidly ceases to be paradise. So there's a couple of pictures of the paradise element, if you like, and one in the middle showing us starting off building a shed, because there was, other than that little shed with the rusty tin roof, which is half fallen down, there was no covered space on the land at all, nothing, and no services of any sort. So we were kind of starting from scratch. And Luke Lampkin, in his book Organic Farming, says that conversion entails quite radical and dramatic changes to the farming system and requires a fundamentally different approach to the management of the farm. And that's true in many cases, and it was obviously true in our case, but we never actually went through a conversion period. That's why I sort of feel a bit of a fraud talking about it, really, because in those days, before the organic regulation came in, which was I think not until 1992, you could call what you produced organic if you wanted to. The relationship you had with the Soil Association or Organic Farmers and Growers, who the other certifier at the time, was entirely voluntary, really. But anyway, so things were more kind of lax and free and easy and much less defined than they are now. And the Soil Association deemed that due to the fact that this land had been more or less abandoned, obviously nothing had been done to it, the access was so difficult that it was quite hard to think of people actually bringing much in the way of materials in, or spray or anything of that sort. So we were allowed to call our first year's produce organic. Well, that's what we did, but there wasn't very much of it. And in fact, looking back, it would have been better probably if we had had a proper conversion period and had taken a much more structured and staged approach to what we were doing. Because of my agricultural background, I thought I knew a bit about it. I had a certain amount of humility. I realized that commercial vegetable growing was something quite different to what I've been doing. But there was that, but there was also the fact that we'd borrowed money as much as we could, basically, for a mortgage on the land, and then also an overdraft for working capital. So it was a matter of getting some sort of return as quickly as possible. But as I say, now looking back on it, and if I came across somebody doing something similar, I would say, well, you might be better thinking of actually spending a year or two getting things in order and making sure that land will do what you want it to do in terms of producing vegetables profitably, rather than just leaping into it. And in that case, getting some work off the farm, even if only part-time work, while you just see about the capital works that are necessary and the improvements that you need to make. It's just to give you a bit more idea of the place. The old ruined house on the on the left there, medieval structure dating back to certainly the 15th century. The barn, or the shed really, which we'd patched up the roof by then, so that was our sole, as I say, our sole covered space. There was a well here in the wall opposite the house, and for washing vegetables we had an old dairy wash tank, and we used to dip or later on pump water out of the well into the trough and stand there washing swedes with the ice sort of forming around. And that, to start with, that little caravan was a home for Jan and I and two small children. It was a dry summer. They had a tent for their toys. You can see some of them stashed underneath the caravan where the dog lived. Over time that grew to be three caravans, two caravans joined together with the kitchen added on, and a third caravan which our daughter Kate moved into when she went to secondary school some years later. So conversion's about two things, I think, as Roger certainly mentioned. It's about converting the land, but it's also about converting yourself. With the land, you're talking about getting to a state where organic methods can work to their full potential. It's not primarily about ridding ground of chemicals. In essence, it's about creating a biologically active soil. Well, I understood that now, and that's probably generally understood, but I didn't really understand it then. My attitude was more that there were things I didn't want to do rather than things that I did want to do. And I think that's still pretty common with people consider that organic farming is about not using this and not using that, whereas it's actually much more about doing this and doing that and allowing the ground to give its full potential, allowing the environment to feed into that in terms of being friendly to a balance of wild species and so on and so forth. So conversion is undoubtedly about the land, and as Roger's also said, it's undoubtedly about yourself, the small space between your ears. And for that, the qualities called for in organic farming are the same as in any other farming, really, but because of the subtleties of its approach, they need to be more fully developed. And I would say they include observation, awareness, humility, so that you're humility in learning, so that you're able to take on new ideas and advice. So this is us or other contractor ploughing the first of the ground. This would have been in March, April of that first year, 1984. I hoped and expected to do all the work myself, but it became obvious immediately, in fact, before I went out and bought myself a plough, that because there were a number of erratic boulders scattered around the place, lurking just beneath the soil in most cases, it wasn't going to do unless I had a trip plough, a sprung-loaded plough where the bodies spring back and they hit an immovable obstruction like a large rock. So I had to rely on a local contractor, a good man, to do that. So that was our start at cultivation, and then in the field on the right, you can see I worked it down. I would have rolled it, harrowed it, maybe gone over the spring tines, harrowed it and rolled it again, and that was became a bed for well, it was a bed for leeks. That field, which is about an acre, we filled with leeks in that first summer. As regards soil structure, I'd done what Roger suggested. Unfortunately, Roger wasn't around in those days, but I'd done what he suggested. I dug before we even bought the place. I dug quite a lot of holes to see what the ground was like, and I'd kind of identify the fields which I felt would be suitable for growing in, and others which weren't. I mean, it was a pretty obvious distinction, really, because some were too steep and some were too wet, but nevertheless, I had a good look round, and it seemed to me that really nicely structured soil, but of course it was, because it'd been under grass for generations. In fact, nobody in the parish could remember any of this ground being ploughed up. So that, in fact, what we were doing, in a way, we were starting to cultivate a soil that had been well structured by earthworm activity and grassroots, but we were about to lose that structure as we lost not the earthworms, but certainly the grassroots. Well, not lose it exactly, but to experience difficulties, because another thing about this aspect of this land was that it's not by any means ideal horticultural ground. It's the soil here is a silty loam. It's surprisingly deep, the topsoil, and it seems to, I would say, although the soil analysis when we started out was pretty poor, there is a kind of natural fertility to it. It seems to hang on to nutrients anyway. So as I said, we thought we needed to, well, we did need to make money in the first year. This field so this was 1984, going through into, by this time of the field on the right, to be 1980, winter 1985. So we ploughed up about 4 fields, total about 8 acres. Tell the field's pretty small, and we grew an acre of potatoes, a couple of acres of Swedes, and a couple of acres of leeks. That doesn't add up to 8 acres, does it? But anyway, maybe it was 5 or 6. What happened in this first field, the field on the left here, was that it was a very droughty summer, and the Swedes all failed. So to replace that, we sowed hungry gat, which is kind of kale rape cross, normally grown for sheep keep, but it's quite an acceptable vegetable as well. Put that in, you just broadcast it, downpour of thundery rain, and it all came up and grew encouragingly well. Not the easiest thing to harvest, quite slow, but there was a bit of a market for it, and what we didn't harvest would have gone for neighbours' sheep at the end of the season. One great thing about this and harvesting this hungry gat was that we got help from a lady who was then getting on a bit in years. She'd moved down to this part of the world in the land army during the war, stayed on, married a local guy, and she worked on a dairy farm up the road a bit where they grew some market garden crops, and she was their picker, and she taught Jan and I how to pick, because we had no idea really. It wasn't something we'd done before. I mean, we pick vegetables in the garden, but it's not quite the same when you're picking them for sale, because basically they're not really worth, vegetables are not worth very much, and you need to be pretty fast at picking them if you're going to be at least a bit successful. And it's a sort of an attitude of mind, and it's hard to explain really, but watching here, we twigged how you did it. So you don't think about individual leaves, you just think about sort of grabbing handfuls, I guess, but at the same time you do it in a kind of discerning way. It's a bit hard to explain, but I guess most growers probably know what I'm talking about. The other field on the other picture on the right is a field across the hedge after those 2 big elms have been cut down, and I was selling them for firewood, which is anybody's chopped down knows is bloody hard work, but to say we needed the money. So we'd put 50,000 leeks in the preceding summer, which we bought as bare root plants. That actually come from Holland. The whole thing was completely mad, really. But anyway, we got them in. Took us about a week to get them in. Very dry summer. They started wilting. We thought it was just rainfall, and then we realised that all the leeks were just disappearing, basically just dying, because a massive wireworm had come up and were eating them, and that was all we was left with. That was sort of overflow into the next field. So we had about 1.5 acres of leeks altogether. Harvested about £500, I think, so that wasn't a great success. The wireworm were, of course, the legacy of the fact that the ground had been in pasture for donkey's years, and they are known as a pest of old pasture, which are a temporary nuisance, or I would even say a temporary disaster, when you plough up old pasture and start sticking in things that wireworm like to eat, which is most things really. So we lost 1 acre of potatoes. We lost near the best part of 50,000 leek plants. They didn't really go for the Swedes, such the Swedes that we did have, which were in another field, and they didn't go for the hungry gat. But we actually had very little to sell. moving on a couple of years, get to summer 87. I should say that 85 was kind of okay. We grew some stuff all right. 86 it just rained all the time. It was complete disaster. And by the end of 86, we were on the teetering on the edge of having to, having to give up, not being able to make the payments to the bank and so on. Jan went out to work, and it turned out to be a brilliant summer. Just one of those summers when you get enough rain but not too much. And we went held up by rain. We could do things in the way we wanted to do, and we found that it did actually work. I mean, a field of cabbages, but it's no big deal, I suppose. They're pretty easy to grow, but it's very encouraging for us to have this 2-acre field full of brassicas and full of life. That's a aerial shot, obviously, of our little farm. 1992. It's taken from a helicopter by Channel 4 when they made a film about our boxes when we started out doing boxes. We'd started the previous year, but 92 they came to film. And this shows a sort of transition. So because we'd been selling on the wholesale market and prices were very low, we'd grown a sort of relatively minor range of crops, not that many different crops. And we'd grown on every bit of ground that was fit to grow on, basically, in order to maximize the returns. When we went to boxes, and this year, 1992, I don't think we sold anything wholesale at all. So we were just growing for our box customers. And it meant that we could put some of the ground that's been growing vegetables since we started out back into grass. So there's a couple of fields there that were seeded out. This is sort of late September, I think, when this picture was taken. On the bits that would have gone into green manure over winter. So talking about conversion, that was another conversion, really, and it was, or if you like, it was another stage in the conversion, because I think conversion sort of, it can certainly last, in our case, lasted a hell of a lot longer than 2 years. So talking about conversion of the bit between the ears, I think an appreciation of the soil is an important, very important part of that. It's to most of us, and in my case too, even though I've been in farming, I've been to agriculture college, it wasn't really until I became an organic farmer that I started, an organic vegetable grower, that I started to understand what the soil was about. And that was because I really, not only because I was working with it intimately, but because you have to, it's a crying need, really. So I won't say anything much about that figures there, because you can read those for yourselves, but it's helpful if you can kind of imagine yourself into the ground. And one way of thinking about it is that if you take the top 6 inches of the soil over an area of an acre, and if you could measure the surface area of all the soil particles that go to make that up, rather than being an acre, that 6 inches would actually turn out to be 3 million acres, which is 2 times the size of Devon, or I understand about half the size of Wales in that one field. Obviously, it depends a lot on the soil type, but as a rough idea, it gives you an idea of how it is that the soil can contain 7.5 tons of living organisms to the hectare, which is more than the carrying capacity, say, livestock on the surface by some distance. Or if you think about an oxygen molecule, which possibly you've never done before, but if you do think about an oxygen molecule, and you consider a crevice in the soil, which is 1/1000th of an inch across, so far too small for us to see, to an oxygen molecule, that 1/1000th of an inch would appear to be a valley 120 miles across. Yeah. The more about ground, and the one lesson that anybody coming new to this business might be able to take away from this rather truncated and messed up presentation of mine is that the great importance of the nature of the ground that you're buying, or I shouldn't say buying, but taking on, that you're converting to organic. Our soil is great in a dry summer, and we were lucky that we had a lot of a succession really of dry summers. But we had, as I said, 1986 was very wet and just about finished us off. This was a wet spring rather than a dry summer, and it did dry up. We did get the polytunnel up. I think that's celeriac there in the background. I can't remember what else went into the field. Possibly under the fleece was a brassica seed bed, quite lightly, with the fleece to stop the flea beetle. But yeah, very frustrating. And the thing about heavy wet soil is that it takes a long time to warm up in the spring. So you're always later than everybody else. And really, until we find on our ground, until the soil does actually warm up, it's very hard to work. It's very hard to get a decent tilth out of it. It's claggy, it hangs together. So it's generally May before I'm, first week in May or so, before I can happily make a decent seed bed outside, which does restrict obviously what you can grow and has an effect on your plant raising, all the rest of it. I think Roger's probably said enough about rotations. You probably don't want to hear any more from me, and there isn't time anyway, but it's just, this is really a bit of an illustration of green manures. This is probably the first time I ever grew grazing rye, and you can see I bolstered it up slightly. It may be because it was too wet, I don't know, but this rye's got much too stemmy before being cut, and I would have had quite a difficult time working it in. On the other hand, the cabbages we saw a few slides back were actually grown after this rye, and they did all right. So I guess by the time the cabbages went in, the rye had worked away okay. The metal object there is the end of a reciprocating finger mower, in case anybody's wondering. A year or two later, I got a flail mower, which is much better for dealing with that sort of stuff. So weeds, simple tools, cheap tools, because we didn't have a great deal of money to spend on things. In those days, you could go to farm sale and get stuff cheap because it was only the local market, rather than now with eBay and such like, the market is national. So I think that steerage hoe we paid probably £10 for. The red things on the back are cord weed combs, which we bought new and fitted to it, and they were, I think, £150 or £200, but they increased the efficiency of the steerage hoe probably 20 or 30 fold, so they were a good buy, really. The other stuff, obvious, really. That's of my pedestrian flamer. I say my pedestrian flamer, it was actually developed by the original OGA back in the early 80s, and there were two of them they made. One of them ended up in Devon, and one of them ended up coming my way, and although other people used it a bit, it's basically been ever since. So, and I still use it a tiny bit, although I've only got a big garden now. Weeds, you get good years and bad years. I think if you get a good year for getting the weeds down, then it's worth keeping the weeds down. It's not really so good to say, well, it's dry, they're not too bad, we'll leave them go. Because in a good year, you keep the weeds down, it does reduce the seed bank. It makes life, well, I find it, just, if you can keep them down, it makes life pleasanter, really. Jan and I have seen a lot of holdings over the years that have drowned under weeds, especially under fat hen or lamb's tongue, as it's called around here, which has an unhappy habit of germinating profusely when most other things are given up because it's got too hot and dry. So yeah, so you have a dry season, good weeding, nice party of weeding people, quite social. We used to enjoy that, very good time. It's a mistake to work people with too many hours. Usually half a day's enough. Make sure they've got a cup of tea halfway through. And some carrots I'm trying to tackle on the other side of the screen, which is a miserable job because it's been wet probably for 4 or 6 weeks and everything's just got packed down by rain and overwhelmed with little weeds. We're getting on here. So Roger mentioned that weeds can have their uses. This is certainly one of them. Overwintering weed in leeks, I think, is better than having no weed at all. I really do, because it does give some protection to the ground. I have tried. No, Tolly's a great exponent of undersowing. I've never, I can't say I've ever been that good at it. I've tried on various occasions. I have undersown leeks with rye corn works quite well. Some of the seed ends up in the leeks and starts growing out of the plants, but not too much of a problem. This is that same field of parsnips that you saw them weeding side or two back. This is after the badgers have been in one night and had a go at them. Obviously, we soon got wise to that, because one thing about converting is being ready for the unexpected and reacting quickly to it. And we pretty quickly put up electric flexi net to stop them getting any worse. But it became a constant problem roughly from that year, which I think that was 1992 as well. I think from that year onwards, we had constant badger problems. A new thing, really. They kind of went for things the pigeons didn't. So carrots, sweet corn, of course, parsnips, beans, peas are like squashing down flat so you can pick them. Bloody nuisance, not that fond of badgers. So here's some netting to keep the badgers out. That's just rabbit flexi netting. You can actually keep badgers out with a couple of strands of plain wire. They don't like it up them, and they're not good jumpers. The flowers, well, I guess we all know by now that it's good idea to grow some flowers in among the crops for diversity and to encourage the predatory insects to come in. And just a quick slide of some predatory insects, the ladybird, which everybody's familiar with. The hoverfly larva, amazingly, really, because I've been, as I say, keep saying I've been farming for several years, and I've been to college and that, and I had no idea what a hoverfly larva looked like. In the first or second year, 1985, when we first had a crop of cabbages, and I was looking at them, cabbages and other brassicas, looking at them about end of September, October time, and I found these little slightly slug-like creatures on the cabbages, and I thought, it doesn't look like they're doing any harm, but I wonder what they are. In those days, ADAS was a free advisory service, still going, but I think now you have to pay for it. In those days, pre-Thatcher, it was all free, and they had a laboratory not that far away. Well, the distance really mattered because you sent the things by post, but you could put your insect, whatever it was, in a matchbox, send it off to the ADAS entomologist and tell you what it was. So I rang this guy up and I said, I've got this thing, I don't know what it is, I'll send it in to you. He said, okay. He said, well, what are you going to do about it? I said to him, well, I don't, because he knew I was organic, this guy. I said, well, I don't know that I need to do anything about it. I just want to know what it is. So anyway, I sent it off, and a couple of days later, he phoned up or whatever. Oh, it's hoverfly larva. I said, well, that's good, isn't it? So he said, yeah, it's good. There are other, so it's always, ladybird's obvious. Hoverfly, the adult hoverflies we're probably aware of. It's hard not to be, even though there aren't as many around as there used to be. But the hoverfly larvae are not so easy to spot, and they go against the grain of predatory insects. Most predatory insects are swift, fast moving. So if you find a fast moving insect, it's probably intent on searching for some meat somewhere. If it's a slow moving insect, it's probably a vegetarian and very likely to be a prey for the meat seeking predator. Sorry about that. Source of information, Roger mentioned these. We mustn't forget Phil's book, which is coming out, Phil's new edition of the Vegetable Grower Handbook. I hope that's right. I hope Phil will correct me if that's wrong. That's coming out in a month or two, which we're looking forward to. But there's nothing really like going out and meeting people and learning from people's successes and their failures and chatting with colleagues, because growers just love being together, really, and you can learn so much and you get so much strength and spirit, I think, from being with other growers. And this was when, before boxes, we were wholesaling through Somerset Organic Producers, a cooperative, and we had co-op farm walks. This is a guy called Stuart Patterson, hope he's still with us, over more sort of Dartmoor way, farming in some really vicious clay loam, over about 3 inches of clay loam over several feet of solid clay. He tried to sell us his land before we bought Northwood. Fortunately, we weren't that stupid, and I think he's still there. But he did an amazing thing, which is convert an old Fergie 35, take the front half off it, put a big boga wheel on the front, fix it up to his horses. He's got the hydraulics and the power takeoff working off the land wheels. And I've got an extraordinary video of extremely poor quality, but nevertheless fairly mesmerizing, of Stuart driving round and round a field with 6 or possibly 8 horses fixed up to a rotavator, and the dust flying and sort of general. Well, I mean, it's not noisy like a tractor, but it's noisy because the horses they're not really sort of jangling along. But Stuart's shouting all the time, basically. He did give him hell, his poor horses. But yeah, no, great man for horses. A lot of his ink he actually made from breeding hunters out of crossing between thoroughbreds and his own Suffolk punch. So yeah, clever man. There's lots of interesting people out there to meet and interesting ideas to discover. And I think we'll make this the last slide. So that this is harvesting for boxes, kind of the end of our conversion period, I suppose you might say, when we got some quite decent crops, good market. We had I think we always had a waiting list really for our boxes. It's crazy in the early days. And so instead of doing stupid things like we'd done through the co-op, like sending pallet loads of marrows up to Spalding so that geese could send them out to supermarkets or whatever, absolute pure craziness. That's not, I mean, they're organic marrows produced on an organic farm, but there's nothing organic about growing marrows in Devon and sending them up to Spalding, of all places. They're just lumps of water, really. So we felt, we had a nice mix of crops, more diverse crops, better rotation as a result of it, and satisfied and eager customers who paid us on the dot, which was extraordinary because bad debt was a non-payment was a constant hazard for growers in the past. Right, that would do.
Roger, have you got anything you think would we need to respond to openly, or otherwise I can wrap it up?
Well, I'm just looking at the question about no dig techniques and where it fits into the conversion process. I mean, much would depend on what the intention is for the land that is being converted. I mean, I guess in theory, mulches could be applied to suppress whatever the existing growth is, and then crops planted through the mulch, whether that be an organic one. I've already differentiated between organic mulches and plastic film mulches and so on. So I think it's not ruled out, but it just depends on what you want to do. And if there's a situation that the kind of thing I talked about with the serious surface compaction, it might be difficult to deal with that in a no dig situation. However, if there's good mulching and there's plenty of earthworm activity, then the compaction can be solved by that. There's a question that the next, I'm just rushing through these now just because we are close on time. The mulching, people's experience, is it better to crimp rather than mow? I don't know, frankly. And I'm just going to go on to Dr.
Just
Elaine.
to say, there are other webinars that we've run. There's one on no dig for sort of rotate, which looks at that in some detail. So if you go to the OGA YouTube channel, you can find a really good session we had with Jesse Frost and with Jane Arnold from and that's well worth watching. So yeah.
Okay, I'll just hopefully deal with the last one then. What are your opinions on Dr. Elaine Ingham's position on soil testing? As I gather, she asserts they have very limited value. Well, that's another webinar in itself. It's very true that on one level, the simpler the soil analysis, the less you can get from it. But I'm firmly of the view that the more complicated the soil analysis, and there are some very complicated ones out there, some of which are linked to Dr. Elaine Ingham's position on soil webs and soil health, can be so complicated that it's difficult to get usable information from them. And very often it requires somebody to interpret them for you, rather than I think a soil analysis that a grower can at least get something from themselves. I mean, yes, always useful to have a point of view, but if it looks like double Dutch and you need someone to tell you what it actually says, then I'm not convinced it's necessarily worth the money. But that's a very personal point of view.
and Roger has written an article right back at the start of the organic grower on the spade test, which is a very good article, and I reproduced it in the book. I think you can also find it online in the back copies of the organic grower, if you remember. And I think there's it's a lot about really just getting to know your own soil and the sight and the smell of it, and things like that, which can be as important as fancy soil testing. So I think
I'd
one
like
other
to
thing
say
I
I'm
want
sorry if I rushed some of those answers, but I think I've managed to deal with everything. Somehow.
Thank you for that, Roger. And one of the things I would like to mention is that the importance of reading the organic standards thoroughly. And a lot of people think they know what organic is, and I've heard it being said by somebody who decided to convert to organic, and she said it wasn't until she read the standards that she really realized what organic meant, and she hadn't realized that before she started. And so I think that is also important, and also realizing that the standards are the baseline, and they are the gateway to best practice, really, and it's a starting point. And there are a lot of there are a lot of good reasons why things are in there, and it's always worth to question why things are there and what it means. But it's certainly a good base and a good start.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I had a client once who was quite an elderly lady, and I think contemporary with the Lady Balfour and others. And she said to me during the course of an OCIS visit, "Jay's fluid is okay in organic systems, isn't it?" And she was quite horrified to find that no, it most certainly wasn't. So yes, absolutely agree with you, Phil, on that one.
Okay, well, I think then on that note, and apologies, it's been a bit rushed and with the technical hiccups in the middle, but I hope you've managed to get something out of it, and follow up some of the links that I'll also send through at the end in a couple of days once we've got the recording together, to all people who've taken part. But just to say thank you very much for Roger and for Tim for spending time preparing, and for talking to us and sharing your experiences over the last sort of 30 years and more. So thank you all, and so I hope you enjoyed it, and wish you all a good rest of the evening. So I will stop recording now, if I can find where it is. Where is it? Recording here.
Okay.